Summer is over, autumn is upon us, and that means one particularly irritating thing in the world of food. That's right, I'm talking about pumpkin spiced everything. Not actually pumpkin anything, but pumpkin spiced. The spices and flavors that you might expect out of a pumpkin pie, but in anything else. Coffee, pastries, ice cream, hand soaps, lotions, I don't even know. But you know which pumpkin spiced things are still delicious and forgivable? Pumpkin. Today in the Great Lakes Kitchen, we're going to be making a beautiful, delicious, smooth, creamy pumpkin butter. Some call it pumpkin jam or pumpkin spread. I've always known it as pumpkin butter. So enough of the intro, it's pumpkin time. And let's get started by taking a look at our ingredients. First, we've got 4 pie pumpkins. Yes, the main ingredient of pumpkin butter is pumpkin puree, and yes, we could just use a couple cans of store-bought pumpkin puree, but what would be the fun in that? So we're gonna make our own, and the proper type of pumpkin for making puree, the same as you would a pumpkin pie, are these little pie pumpkins. Next, we've got some brown sugar. I'm using dark brown sugar, some maple syrup, some apple cider. I'll mention you could use apple juice, but it's cider season, so why not? Then a little lemon juice, some butter, cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, ground cloves, and a little bit of kosher salt. And I'm going to mention 2 things before we get started. First, you can make this perfectly well with cans of pumpkin puree. But I figure if I'm going to go through all the effort of making a video about it, I might as well do the entire thing starting with actual pumpkins. And secondly, I'd love to be making this a pumpkin butter canning video, but the problem is you can't home can pumpkin butter. Well, I mean, you can, but it's absolutely not recommended by the USDA and the healthy canning and any sources of canning information that you might know or trust. Lots of people still do it. I tend to stick pretty closely with the official recommendations, so I do not. And the reason you can't can pumpkin butter at home is because it's simply too thick and viscous and dense. When you're heat canning, you need the heat to penetrate all the way to the center of whatever's in your jar. And when the material in there is just that dense, you can't be guaranteed that it does. So it can't be considered technically safe. Now, of course, the first thing I have to do is make the pumpkin puree. And there's pretty much 2 ways to do that I find effective. And we're gonna quickly go through both methods. One involves roasting the pumpkins, the other involves steaming. Now for our first method, roasting, it's really quite simple. First, I'll remove the crown off of the pumpkin, then cut it in half, then scoop out all those seeds and that membrane in there. Then these pumpkin halves are just going face down on a parchment lined baking sheet, and then they're going into a 400-degree oven for 50 to 60 minutes. After they come out, I'm gonna let them cool down quite a bit so I can start scooping that flesh away from the skin. Then that flesh that I scooped out is going right into the food processor. I'll blend this up until it's about as pureed as I can get it. And I'll mention that if you want it extra sort of velvety smooth, you can run it through a sieve or a food mill. Makes it a little smoother, maybe a little bit less fibrous texture, but honestly with these pie pumpkins, I never seem to really have a problem with the texture, so I skip that step. And now we can move on to the second method for making our puree. And it starts off kind of similar, except the first thing we have to do is actually peel the pumpkins. And this is a little bit of a pain, which is why I think a lot of people don't do this method. But if you've got a good peeler and you can just sort of go to town on these things, you can make quick work of it. Then, once again, we're removing the crown where the stem is, cutting it in half, scooping out the seeds, but now we're gonna chop up that pumpkin flesh into some small pieces. And they're gonna go into my big steaming pot for 30 to 40 minutes. Once they're nice and tender, they're coming out, let as much of that water drip off as possible, and then they're going right into the food processor. Alright, and so here we have all of the puree we're going to be using. Today I'm making a double batch, and I definitely needed all 4 of those pie pumpkins. And I've got a little bit left over, but not very much. And by the way, as always, check out the video description below and I'll have the full recipe and all the ingredients and measurements. But just to recap, I've got enough puree in this pot right now for a double batch, which is 60 ounces of puree or just about 8 cups. Now I just have to throw in almost all of the other ingredients. Basically everything except the butter, the brown sugar, the maple syrup, apple cider, lemon juice, and my dried, quote, pumpkin spices. Now we're over at the stove, and as I start whisking everything in this pot together, I'm going to turn the heat on and I want to bring it up to a very low boil. And by the way, I'm using my sort of medium-sized stock pot for this because A, I am making a double batch, and B, I don't mind there being a lot of room in here because once this starts simmering, and it has to simmer for a while, we're gonna start getting a lot of spattering. And anything I can do to kind of contain that from being a mess, I'm all for it. And it does not take long for this to start spattering like crazy. And at this point, I'm going to turn the heat down to quite low. And we just have to let this go for about 50 to 60 minutes. What I'm trying to do is let it cook down and reduce quite a bit until it's nice and thick and just at the consistency I'm looking for. And I will make sure to stir it pretty regularly because I don't want anything starting to scorch or stick to the bottom of the pot. But in the meantime, I am going to keep this big mesh spatter guard in place. And while it's not foolproof and spatter is still kind of getting through, it's really going to reduce a lot of the mess. So we'll pick it back up in a little while when this is closer to being ready, and we'll talk about what's next. And here we are. It's been about 50 minutes and I'm really liking the looks of this. It's really thick, which is what I'm going for. You can see when I move the spoon across the bottom of the pot, it leaves a slight little trail before the rest of it kind of fills it in. And that's what I'm looking for. So this is absolutely screaming hot right now and I need to let it sit a few minutes before I do the next thing. So we're going to pick it up there. Alright, our pumpkin butter's been cooling about 15 minutes, and now I'm just going to throw in the last ingredient, and that's that butter. I'll just stir until it's completely melted and incorporated, and this is just going to give it a little bit of a richness and help the appearance get kind of a nice silky smooth look to it. And now I'm just going to let this sit here and continue to cool until it's pretty well down to room temperature. At which time I'll transfer it to some containers and it's going in the refrigerator because pumpkin butter, in most people's opinion, is best served cold. And in that time, all of those flavors will have had plenty of opportunity to totally meld and blend together, giving us the most delicious final product possible. And after being in the refrigerator for several hours, it's finally ready to enjoy. My favorite way to eat it? On a hearty slice of good whole grain toast. So if you're like me and you like pumpkin spice, but pretty much only when it involves actual pumpkin, give this pumpkin butter recipe a try and you're not going to be disappointed. And best of all, it freezes exceptionally well. Store in an airtight container or do what I do and vacuum seal it. Now I have lots of amazing delicious pumpkin butter for months longer than I'll even be able to find pie pumpkins at the store. And again, check out the description below for the full recipe. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future food videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this is Great Lakes Prepping.